In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the multi-wavelength characteristics of a very unusual close binary system, AR Scorpii. This system has been known for over 100 years to be a variable star, but only recently was it realized to be something of more importance. So from the 1970s, it had been misclassified as a delta Scuti star since it showed a several hour periodicity in photometry. The long-term light curve is shown in this slide where you can see the digitized Harvard plate results that show no real long-term variability and a lot of scatter around about 1.5 magnitudes, but no other long-term trends. The picture for this star changed in 2016 when Tom Marsh and his collaborators published results from a campaign they undertook using the UltraCam high-speed CCD camera, in which they discovered short periodicities at 2 minutes, which they have attributed to the rotation of a white dwarf system. And in fact, we're able to measure from accurate photometry a change in the period, a P dot term, implying that the system was slowing down and would in fact synchronize within a timescale of about 10 to the 7 years. So this is an extract from Marsh et al.'s paper showing the high-speed photometry from ultraviolet right through to the radio, and on the right is a zoom in of the pulsations, which you can see show both the evidence of the 2-minute fundamental period and also the smaller peak, which is a result of the harmonic. So the interesting nature of this system comes from the spectral energy distribution, which is characterized basically by a non-thermal spectrum, all the way from the radio to the infrared, and actually subsequent studies have shown that the synchrotron component at higher frequencies as well into the X-rays. So these data are both the observations that Marsh and his collaborators obtained, together with some archival data. And the two curves that are shown there in red and blue are the basically the components that come from the two stellar sources in the system, the red dwarf, M dwarf companion, and the prediction of what the white dwarf spectrum would be. So there's been several other studies of the system over the years, including additional X-ray observations that have extended the SED to X-ray wavelengths, and the right-hand plot shows the results of the XMM Newton observation, where both the mean and pulsed components are shown. The mean component is explained as an optically thin thermal plasma emission. So what powers AR Sco? What produces the luminosity in this system? We see that there's a large pulse luminosity of up to 10 to the 32 ergs per second. A logical explanation in a system like this, which has a 3.6 hour orbital period, I might add, is that it could be produced by accretion, as in a cataclysmic variable. However, there's no signs of flickering in the light curve. There's no broad or complex emission lines from an accretion disk or a stream. The only lines present are quite narrow lines that seem to come from the inner face of the M star, which is irradiated by the white dwarf or its vicinity. But the telling point is that the X-ray luminosity is very low, and so is about 1/100th of that typical of, say, a cataclysmic variable or a magnetic cataclysmic variable. So the explanation for the luminosity in the system comes from the spin down of a radiating dipole in the form of a magnetic white dwarf. And if you calculate what the luminosity would be for the change in period or frequency, then you see here that for a white dwarf spinning down at the observed spin down rate, that we get to a luminosity which can be explaining the actual observations. And so the conclusion from the initial studies of AR Sco is that it's a detached white dwarf M dwarf binary with a 3.6 hour orbital period, and it's powered by the white dwarf magnetic dipole spin down. Other observations which have been crucial to probing the nature of this system has been polarimetry. And from 2016, myself and my colleague Steve Potter at SAO have observed this system and discovered strongly pulsed linear polarization at both the 117-second spin period and the 118-second beat period, and at their harmonics. And the plot here shows the variations in total intensity at the top, and then the total polarized flux at the bottom, where you can see this large change in polarization flux. And more importantly, the fact that the polarization reaches 40% linear. So more intensive observations were done later in 2016 and 2017, and these have now been published in a paper in 2018 and used to derive a sort of time series investigation and determine a geometrical model to explain the polarized emission in AR Sco. So on the right in this slide, you see the complex power spectrum of the polarized flux, which is basically explained by two periods in the system: the orbital period, omega, big omega, and the spin period, little omega, and the sidebands, which are essentially the beat periods between those. And all the other structure that you see in there are either the harmonics or the sidebands themselves, and the aliasing structure from the sampling. And the interesting thing about this is that the linear polarization, as I say, varies from almost 0 to 40%, but just as importantly, the position angle changes by 180 degrees over the spin cycle. And that's really an indicator of a rotating magnetic dipole, as is shown in this bottom panel where I've plotted the Stokes Q and U parameters over one spin cycle, where this loop here is the main fundamental, and then the harmonic, so the secondary pulse. And so this is very reminiscent of the behavior of these Stokes QU diagrams for example, pulsars, and in particular, the optical polarization of the crab is very similar to this. So the model that we came up with that's based on these data takes as an initial starting point the model developed by Takata et al. To explain the X-ray emission in the system. And basically this involves injection of relativistic electrons from the vicinity of the secondary star into the white dwarf magnetosphere that are then accelerated along the magnetic field lines to the mirror points in the magnetosphere above the poles of the magnetic white dwarf. And in so doing, these relativistic electrons emit predominantly in the direction of travel. And furthermore, the polarization behavior is such that it's emitted in two lobes here for the linear. These two black lines represent the direction of beaming of the polarized component. The green is the total flux, and the orange or brown one is the circular flux. So in profile, the beams would look like this, which implies for the linear, you expect a double pulse of linear polarization over the spin cycle. So the model that was developed was used to produce these diagnostic diagrams which show spin phase versus orbital phase for all of the different parameters like total flux, linear flux, and circular flux. And for a spin modulated polarization, you expect these to be constant lines at a particular spin phase, not changing with orbital phase. So a light curve would be a cut in orbital phase across this diagram that would show the pulse. And so on the right is the sort of little model that's developed for single pole emission from electrons injected into the magnetosphere. So what we then did was modulate the spin emission on the orbital period, since the beat frequency is significant and we know there's such modulation, and develop this so-called two-pole model where one pole is more obvious than the other as in terms of our viewing perspective. So this is the model that shows the total flux at the top, linear, polarized flux, circular, and then the linear position angle. And on the right is the actual observations. And you can see that the models and observations agree pretty well with each other. So basically the model that we've now developed involves a spin down powered magnetic white dwarf, which if you plug that into the magnetic dipole luminosity equation, we arrive at a magnetic field strength of maximum of 500 megagauss, but of the order of a few hundred megagauss. And furthermore, that this whole system resides inside the light cylinder, which is roughly 8 times the separation of the two stars. Other models have been suggested which involve bow shocks and interactions with the secondary from the magnetic white dwarf. And all of these involve producing the emission in the vicinity of the M star at its trailing or leading surface. So last year in June, we had a multi-wavelength campaign on this object, which involves spectroscopy, high-speed photometry, X-ray observations, and meerkat radio observations. And it was over a 3-day period where we were able to get, in many cases, simultaneous overlap between all of these different wavelength regimes. For the 6 SALT observations, we obtained really high quality data on spectra of H alpha, and these trailed spectra show 3 different observations where we've taken 10-second exposures with no dead time and stacked them for the whole duration of the observation. And what you can see is the modulation of these emission lines, as well as the structure variations as well. Basically, when you take this data and fold it, you produce a folded trailed spectrum, as in the diagram on the left. And we used the so-called inside-out tomography to try and map where the emission is in the binary system. And that's shown on the right-hand side, where there's 2 emission regions, in the lighter blue and the darker blue, the dominant one coming in the trailing the secondary star. Radio observations, we obtained L-band observations with meerkat. In comparison, there's the VLA on the right. And here we see the data, the actual light curves, and the periodograms, the power spectra showing the spin period is detected, unlike in the VLA observations. So in total, in summary, we've shown that this is a unique system dominated by synchrotron emission. It shows aspects of pulsars. We had a successful campaign on this last year in 2020, and we hope to test and develop future models with this data.